Whispers of Ashwood. Amidst the endless fields, where the wind whispers forgotten names, like the voices of the dead, and the sun, like a lonely eye, watches everything but sees nothing, lay the town of Ashwood. Once a thriving place, where life pulsed, it was now like a pale shadow of its former self, like a ghost town, forgotten by all. But in the depths of its dark alleys, behind the dilapidated houses where the wind played with the crumbling plaster, and the abandoned shops whose signs had long since peeled away, a secret lay hidden, like a forgotten melody that still pulsed in the very heart of the town, like a heavy disease. The story began with the arrival of a mysterious stranger named Caleb. No one knew where he came from, no one knew his past. He appeared in Ashwood on the 1st of June, 2021, as if from nowhere, from the very abyss, dressed in an old, tattered cloak with a hood concealing his face, as if he were hiding not only his identity but also his soul. Caleb settled in the town's gloomiest inn, the Dismal Cat, whose name spoke for itself on the second floor, in the furthest room, which seemed darker than the rest. Locals shunned him. He was like a dark stain against a gray sky, like a harbinger of doom. After a few weeks, strange things began to happen. At first, there were minor incidents that could be dismissed as coincidences. The unexplained disappearance of pets, which seemed to dissolve into thin air, strange sounds at night, like a child's cry, and inexplicable gusts of icy wind, even though it was unbearably hot outside, as if someone was trying to freeze them with fear. But gradually, these phenomena became more and more frightening, as if someone was playing with them, testing their patience. Doors began to open on their own, as if pushed by invisible hands. Shadows changed their shapes as if they were alive, and the smell of decaying flesh and sulfur filled the air, as if hell itself had arrived. On the 11th of July, a bloodless corpse was found in the town park, and on his chest, a strange symbol was carved. All the blood had been drained from him as if he had been drunk. The locals were horrified. They began to realize that what was happening was not random. Soon, everyone in Ashwood knew Caleb's name. He became the embodiment of all their fears, and his name was whispered with dread, like a curse. People said they had seen him wandering the streets at night, like a shadow gliding between houses, and his eyes burned with red light, like embers, as if he were a demon come from hell. They claimed that he was not human, but something else, something sinister, something that should not have existed in this world, that he had brought darkness into this world. On July 23rd, a young woman named Emily decided to challenge fear, unaware that it might be her last act. She was a skeptic and did not believe in fairy tales, and believed that there was a logical explanation for everything, that behind every nightmare stood ordinary human cruelty. Emily was a local journalist, and she was interested in this story. She saw in it not just horror, but an opportunity, a chance for fame. She decided to find Caleb and find out what was really happening, thinking that she would expose this hoax, and everything would be as before. She thought that there were mundane events behind the story, but she was wrong. In the evening at 8 o'clock, as the sun began to sink beyond the horizon, Emily set off for the Dismal Cat Inn, as if walking towards certain death. The owner, an old woman named Agatha, whose eyes seemed to have seen more than was possible, tried to dissuade her, but Emily was unyielding, as if possessed. Agatha said that she had seen Caleb go out every evening, in the dark, and that he was definitely not human, that he was something greater and more terrifying. She even tried to tell Emily about the past horrors that had happened in this town, but Emily did not listen to her. Emily, nevertheless, went up to the second floor and knocked on Caleb's door. Silence, an ominous and frightening silence. She knocked again, but there was silence again, as if no one was there, or as if there was something there that was silently waiting. She pulled on the handle and the door, strangely enough, opened, as if inviting her to come in, as if it were a trap. The room was dark and cold, as if sunlight had never graced it, as if eternal night reigned in it, as if it was in another dimension. On the table lay an open book made of human skin, written in an unknown language, as if in the language of demons. Strange symbols were drawn on the walls, which pulsed in the dark as if alive, and on the floor was a circle in which incomprehensible symbols were also inscribed, as if it were some ancient ritual, a summoning of some entity. Emily felt a wave of anxiety engulf her. She began to sense an invisible presence. Suddenly, she heard a sound. Footsteps. They were quiet but distinct, as if someone was approaching her, as if she was being hunted. Emily turned around, her heart skipped a beat. In the doorway stood Caleb, like a shadow from the darkness itself. His face was hidden by his hood, but she felt that he was looking at her, as if she was his prey, and that he was reading her thoughts. She wanted to speak, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat, as if someone had clamped her mouth shut. Caleb slowly approached Emily. His hands were unnaturally pale, with long, thin fingers that seemed bony and ended in long claws. He reached out and touched her cheek. Emily felt an icy chill, like the touch of death, as if her soul was being touched by darkness, and this cold penetrated her mind. Then Caleb spoke, and his voice sent a chill down her spine. His voice was hoarse and quiet, like the whisper of the wind, but the words echoed in her mind, in that incomprehensible language in which the book was written, as if she was merely a relay for his words. Emily didn't remember what happened next. She seemed to fall into darkness, into oblivion, and a piece of her life was erased from her consciousness. When she came to, she was not in the inn. She was in some strange place, and she realized that her reality had been distorted, and that she was no longer in this world. It was a cave, on the walls of which were carved the same symbols that she had seen in Caleb's room, but now they pulsed and glowed from within, as if they were part of some portal. In the center of the cave was an altar made of human bones, and on it lay several human skeletons, as if they were sacrifices. Emily was horrified. Her fear turned into panic. She felt her mind giving way to darkness. She couldn't understand how she got here, and where she was, and she felt as if she was being watched. She looked around. She noticed that there was another entrance in the cave, as if a path to salvation. She ran there as if escaping a pursuer, as if running away from her own fear. She found herself in a forest, but the forest was not as she remembered it. It was distorted, as if chaos had settled in it. The trees were black and leafless, as if they had withered from some terrible disease, and they seemed to reach out to her, as if they were trying to grab her with their claws. The ground was covered with moss and rotting leaves, and the smell of death and sulfur hung in the air, as if she had found herself in hell itself. Emily tried to get her bearings, but she didn't understand where she was, and which way she should go, as if she was lost in a nightmare. She wandered through the forest for several hours until she came across an old hut that seemed like salvation to her. It was abandoned and dilapidated, but nonetheless, she decided to go inside, as if hoping to find some kind of shelter there. Inside, it was dark and damp, and the air was heavy and stuffy. On the floor lay old books and scrolls, covered in dust and cobwebs, as if they had not been touched for an eternity. Emily began to read them, as if possessed. The books were written in different languages, including the language Caleb spoke, but she understood them, as if someone was prompting her their meaning. She learned that Ashwood was built on the site of an ancient cemetery, and that beneath it lies a certain ancient evil, waiting for its awakening, which seemed to be watching her, as if she was its food. She learned that Caleb was not human, but one of those who were trying to awaken that evil, that he was like a conduit between worlds, and that he was searching for the key to open a portal between worlds, and that she was that key, and that her soul was destined for it. Emily felt despair engulf her, as if she was being swallowed by darkness. She realized that she would not be able to go home, and that she had become part of this nightmare, that she was just a pawn in someone's sinister game. She looked back, and in the doorway of the hut, she saw Caleb, and behind him in the darkness, she could make out the silhouettes of figures whose eyes burned with red fire, like a whole army of demons. He was smiling, and his smile was insane, as if he was pleased that he had caught her. It was not a kind smile, but a smile of anticipation, the smile of a predator who was about to tear apart his prey. Emily understood that she was doomed, and that her soul no longer belonged to her. On the 16th of August, an investigation into Emily's disappearance began at the local police station. The sheriff, named Thomas, did not understand what was happening. but he felt that something terrible was happening in his town. He didn't believe in fairy tales, but what was happening in Ashwood went beyond logic. He felt like he was going crazy. He could not explain the disappearance of pets, the bloodless corpses, and Emily's sudden disappearance, as if the darkness had taken them. But he understood that something was wrong, and that he had to do something before it was too late. Thomas decided to study the town's archives in search of any information, in search of an answer to this nightmare. He found old records of the ancient cemetery on which Ashwood was built, and of the ancient evil that lay beneath it, as if he was a silent witness to history. He understood that Caleb had not just appeared in the town, and that everything that had been happening lately was connected with this, that he was just a puppet of this evil. But it was too late. The darkness had already engulfed the town. Thomas went to the Dismal Cat Inn where Caleb had settled, as if walking towards certain death. The owner, Agatha, was horrified. She told Thomas what she had seen, and that Caleb had left the inn many days ago, and that he had not been alone, that in the darkness, she could make out strange figures that were following him, as if they were his army. She said that she saw a shadow that was following him and that it looked a lot like Emily. But in the eyes of that shadow, there was no trace of humanity. Thomas went up to the second floor and entered Caleb's room. The room was empty as a grave. Only the smell of sulfur remained. The only thing he found was a book made of human skin with incomprehensible symbols that seemed to pierce his consciousness, like poisonous claws. Thomas did not touch it. He understood that it could be dangerous, that it could curse him. He decided to go back to the station and study it there, but the book had disappeared, as if it had never existed. At that moment, Thomas heard a scream, and that scream was not human. It was terrible and loud, as if evil itself was screaming, as if hell had opened its gates. Thomas ran out of the hotel and saw that the sky had darkened, and there were neither stars nor a moon on it, only complete darkness, and the earth began to shake as if it were alive. From the center of the town, a pillar of black smoke and fire began to rise, as if an abyss had opened, and from it, as if being born from hell, dark silhouettes began to appear, as if hordes of demons were ready to devour this world. Thomas realized that the portal was open, that he was too late. Thomas tried to contact the other police officers, but the communication was broken. He was cut off from the outside world, as if the darkness had swallowed him. He was alone and his fate was sealed. He understood that Ashwood was doomed, and that he was too. He picked up his weapon and ran toward the town, knowing that he would most likely die, that it was his last battle. Since that day, Ashwood has disappeared from the map forever, as if it had never existed, and only emptiness remained in its place. No one has ever seen it again, and no one has ever heard of it again, as if it was erased from history. But rumors say that sometimes at night, in the place where the town used to be, you can hear the whispers of the wind, like the voices of the dead, and see ghostly shadows that glide between the trees. And that it is not the wind, and not shadows, but the ghosts of those who died, who are crying out for help, and that they are waiting, that they are trying to warn, but no one hears them. They say that Caleb is still wandering this world, and that he is looking for new victims in order to open the portal between worlds, and that he can be anywhere, that he can be hiding in the shadows and waiting for you to stumble. Even next to you, even right behind your back. The last mention of Ashwood was in the archives, in which records were found that on November the 5th, 2023, a strange anomaly was observed in the place of the town, and that a black hole seemed to have opened there, and that it was getting bigger every day, and that one day it will swallow the whole world. The cartographer's labyrinth. The salt-laced wind, sharp as broken glass, carried whispers of forgotten languages across the Isle of Ethel, a craggy, desolate place where the sea seemed to claw at the land's edge, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. It was here, on this forgotten scrap of earth, that the old lighthouse stood sentinel, its beam a futile attempt to pierce the oppressive fog that clung to the island like a shroud, a beacon that offered no comfort, only a reminder of the isolation. No one had lived on Ethel in generations, not since the whispers grew too loud, and the shadows stretched too long, taking the form of grotesque shapes that seemed to mock human existence. Or so the legend went, a tale told in hushed tones by sailors who dared to venture too close to its shores. The year is 1972. A young cartographer named Elias Thorne, a man more comfortable with the precise lines of maps than the chaotic unpredictability of people, arrived on the island by a small, sputtering boat, its engine groaning as if it were trying to escape its fate. He had been drawn to Ethel by an ancient, incomplete map he had found in a dusty London archive, a map that was not made of paper, but from a material that resembled human skin, a map that spoke of a hidden structure, a labyrinth said to twist through dimensions, a gateway to realms beyond human understanding. He arrived on the 6th of June, determined to complete the map and uncover the secrets it held, driven by a curiosity that bordered on madness. Elias settled into the abandoned keeper's cottage, a place that smelled of damp stone, mildew, and forgotten lives, a place that seemed to breathe with its own malevolent life. The first few weeks were uneventful, spent exploring the island's rugged coastline and charting the ruins of a long-abandoned village, each ruin bearing the same strange symbols that he saw on the map. He found nothing of significance, nothing that matched the strange, pulsating symbols on the ancient map, which seemed to shift and change depending on the light. The silence of the island was unnerving, broken only by the mournful cries of gulls, which sounded like tortured souls, and the ceaseless crashing of waves, which seemed to be trying to swallow the land whole. Yet, he felt like he was being watched, like eyes were following him from the shadows of the old stones, and that those eyes were not human, but something more ancient. Then, on the 21st of July, Elias found it, a hidden entrance in the side of a cliff face, concealed behind a veil of thick ivy that seemed to writhe and pulsate as he approached, a mouth into the darkness. It was a rough-hewn tunnel leading downwards, the air around it noticeably colder, a frigid breath that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. He knew, with a certainty that sent a chill down his spine, that this was the entrance to the labyrinth from the map, that he was not simply mapping it, but entering it. He entered the tunnel, a single lantern his only companion in the encroaching darkness, its light casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The tunnel descended steeply, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic, until it opened into a large cavern, a space that felt both ancient and alien. The walls were lined with strange carvings, symbols that seemed both familiar and utterly alien, as if they were a language he could understand but could not speak. In the center of the cavern was a circular stone structure, its surface covered in intricate patterns that pulsed with a faint, inner light, the patterns shifting and changing, as if they were alive. The labyrinth had begun, and with it, the unraveling of his mind. As Elias explored deeper, the passages became more maze-like, and the symbols more complex, now appearing on the floor and ceiling, and everywhere he looked. He began to lose his sense of time and direction, and his perception of space and reality. The walls seemed to shift, the corridors lengthening and shortening, as if the structure itself was alive, breathing and toying with him. He recorded his progress in a worn leather notebook, its pages filling with increasingly erratic handwriting, a desperate attempt to maintain some sense of order in the growing chaos, and that even the words seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when he looked away. He documented the date, the 2nd of August, and the time, roughly 11 in the morning, before he continued, but as he turned the page, he found that his last entry had been overwritten by different handwriting, and a phrase that he didn't remember writing. The map is not the territory, and the territory is not your. He found that the labyrinth was not just a physical place, but something else, something that was affecting him on a deeper level. He started having vivid dreams, nightmares that seemed to bleed into reality, and they were getting more intense with each passing night. He would wake up in different places, sometimes miles from where he had fallen asleep, sometimes the labyrinth, sometimes in his room, sometimes on the shore, and sometimes in a place that he didn't recognize. The carvings on the walls began to speak to him, not in words, but in images, feelings, a sense of something ancient and hungry, something that was slowly consuming his mind. He began to hallucinate, seeing shadows moving in the periphery of his vision, and then in front of his eyes, they started to take grotesque forms, with eyes that seemed to stare right through him. He started to feel his body changing, like the skin was crawling, and his bones were shifting. On the 15th of August, Elias found a large chamber, its walls covered with strange carvings, which seemed to rearrange themselves when he blinked. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it, a strange, crystalline object, radiating an intense, almost painful light, its red glow pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. He felt compelled to touch it, a primal urge that overrode his sense of self-preservation, an invitation that he couldn't refuse. As his fingers brushed the crystal, a wave of energy coursed through him, and he saw a vision, a brief glimpse of countless universes, all intersecting in this single point, all vying for his attention. He saw things he could not comprehend, beings that defied description, and felt the weight of millennia upon his soul, as his mind was being opened to something that he wasn't meant to see, and that it was something more than just horror. He awoke on the 23rd of August, on the shore of the island, the sand cold and damp beneath his skin. He did not remember how he got there, and he felt as though someone had erased all his memories. He did not remember how much time has passed, but he knew that he wasn't the same anymore. Something inside him had changed. He felt different, changed, as if he had been replaced by something else, something that was using his body as a vessel and was slowly taking control. The maps in his notebook no longer made sense. Their lines were distorted and the locations were shifted. The familiar landmarks of the island seemed warped and twisted, and the lighthouse, which should have been a reassuring beacon, now felt like an ominous monolith, a black tower pointing towards a sky that was no longer his own. He looked at the sky, but it was dark as night, even though he felt like it was morning, and the stars were aligned in a pattern that defied human understanding. He decided to explore the island again, driven by a compulsion that was not his own, in order to find the labyrinth again, and to map what he could not comprehend. As he explored the area, he stumbled upon a small, unmarked graveyard. The gravestones sunk deep into the ground. The headstones were ancient, almost crumbled to dust, and all of them were marked with the same symbols he saw in the labyrinth. But as he looked closer, he noticed that each headstone contained the same symbol that he had seen in the labyrinth, a spiral that seemed to suck the light from the world, and that some of them seemed to have been recently disturbed. He realized that the island itself was a part of the structure, and that all that he saw was connected to it, that he was not just a cartographer but a part of this map himself. On the 10th of September, Elias returned to the lighthouse, hoping to find some answers, to understand what was happening to him, to his mind, to his body, to the world. He climbed the winding staircase to the lantern room, but found that it was not what he remembered, that the lighthouse was changing just like his mind. The gears were rusted and frozen, the glass was cracked, and the lamp was extinguished, as if they had been replaced with something else. Instead, a large mirror was standing where the lamp used to be, and the reflection it showed was not his own. When he looked into it, he saw not his reflection, but a series of distorted images, like a glimpse into a nightmare. The labyrinth, the crystal, the ancient symbols, and a dark, shapeless entity that seemed to be calling to him, a being that radiated pure malevolence. He did not understand what was happening, but he felt as if his mind was being invaded, as if he was being used as a conduit for something ancient and powerful. It was on the 18th of September, at 7 in the evening, that he started writing on his hand, words that did not seem to come from him, using his blood as ink. He wrote, "The map is not the territory, and the territory is not yours," and felt a cold shiver as he realized he had no control over his hand, and that his body had become a canvas for something else. He looked into the mirror, but he saw someone else, someone with eyes that were pure black, and a smile that made his blood freeze. Elias started having conversations with himself, except it wasn't him, it was the entity. He argued with this entity that seemed to take over his mind, his voice now a mixture of his own and something else, something inhuman. He tried to reason with it, to find out what it wanted, but it only responded with cryptic phrases and unsettling laughter, as if it was amused by his futile struggle. He was losing control, and that was the scariest part, as he was now a prisoner in his own mind, watching himself become something else. On the 26th of September, Elias found himself back in the labyrinth, but everything had changed, as if the labyrinth was twisting itself inside his own mind. The walls were now covered with grotesque carvings that pulsed with an unnatural light, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and sulfur, and he could feel the eyes of something watching him from the shadows. He could hear whispering, countless voices all around him, speaking in a language he did not understand, but that he could feel, a language that was old and primal, a language that was driving him mad. He found more chambers, each one more horrifying than the last, and in one of those chambers he found himself, but not the Elias that he was, but something else, something that was a grotesque parody of himself. He saw things moving in the shadows, shapes that defied description, and the feeling that he was a mere prey in a cosmic game, a pawn in the hands of something that did not know him and did not care for him. He tried to retrace his steps, to find a way out, but the passages were constantly shifting, and the symbols seemed to be mocking him, changing and moving, becoming more and more complex, and more unsettling. He was lost, not only in the labyrinth but in his own mind, and his sanity was now a broken and tattered thing. He stopped making entries in his journal because they started having the same phrases over and over again, and because he could no longer hold the pen. He was slowly losing himself as the entity was taking over, and that he was about to become something else, something that was not human. On the 1st of October, he found the crystalline object again, but it was different, more like a beating heart, pulsing with a malevolent life. It was darker, more malevolent, and now pulsing with a red light that seemed to suck the light from everything around it. A beacon to a hell that was about to break into his world. As he reached out to touch it, he saw another vision. A twisted version of the island, populated by grotesque beings that seemed to be made of nightmares, and a dark, immense vortex opening up in the sky, its edges tearing apart the fabric of reality. He realized, with a bone-chilling horror, that he was not mapping the labyrinth, he was opening it, that he was not meant to map, but to open the gate. He cried, "No, no, no," over and over again as the visions kept coming, each one more terrifying than the last. He awoke again on the shore, but the island was even more distorted than before, as his mind was now broken and his vision was clouded with shadows. The sky was a swirling vortex of darkness and red, and the lighthouse was gone, replaced by a black, obsidian spire that seemed to pierce the heavens, a monument to a hell that was now taking over. He saw that all the buildings were now in a grotesque shape, and felt the presence of the beings that he saw in his visions, who were now emerging from the vortex, and were closing in on him, and that he was now one of them. He understood that this was not the island anymore, that he had brought it to another place, and that he had doomed it, and that he had doomed himself. He started writing on the sand, using his own blood, drawing the symbols that he saw on the walls, in a last attempt to understand what they meant, a last cry for salvation, as the beings from the vision were now emerging from the vortex, and were closing in on him, their forms distorted and terrifying. He finished his last drawing, and the beings caught up with him, and he felt as if he was being torn apart, his mind finally shattered. His last words were, "The key is within the map, but the map is not the key, and the key does not open the door, but the door opens you," a warning that will never be heard. On the 15th of October, a small fishing boat found Elias's boat, drifting aimlessly in the sea near where Ethel was supposed to be, the boat now covered with strange symbols. There was no sign of Elias, nor was there any island, and the place where Ethel should have been was nothing more than fog and endless water. The map that Elias had was nowhere to be found, only the notebook with the countless entries, written in his blood, and which made no sense. To this day, no one knows what happened to Elias Thorne. Some say he was lost at sea, and that the island was just a myth. Others say the Isle of Ethel never existed, that it was just a fabrication of his own mind. But those who know the whispers say that it exists but not in our world, that it has crossed the veil, and that it is now part of something else, something that is older than the universe itself. They say that it is waiting in another dimension, waiting to be mapped again, and to come back, and that it is drawing you to it. And those who know the whispers say that sometimes, when the fog is heavy, and when the stars are aligned in a strange pattern, you can hear the sound of a ticking clock and feel the presence of someone watching, and that the person watching is not human. The last entry that was found in the archives of the small fishing boat was, "The map is not the territory, and the territory is not yours," written in blood over and over again, as if he was trying to warn them. And then, a single line, "We are one. And the date, the 31st of October, and the time, 12 at night, a time of crossings between worlds and when the veil is thin.